Welcome to the National Archives and today's Researcher Talk. I'm Richard Hunt, the Director of the Center for Legislative Archives, the host for the Researcher Talk series. The program itself is the brainchild of Dr. Richard McCulley, the Center's first historian and one of our honored guests today. Welcome, Richard. I want to remind you that our next talk will be on December 1st with two historians from the State Department, William McAllister and Joshua Botts, who will talk about the extraordinarily valuable Foreign Relations of the United States series, which presents the official documentary history of U.S. foreign policy from 1861 up through the Reagan administration. They're working on George H.W. Bush now. Today, we have the good fortune to be joined by Carol Tilley, Associate Professor at the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Her talk has the beautifully dismissive title, not hers, I see. Dear Sirs, I believe you're wasting your time. How quaint in today's political lexicon. I can assure you that you are not wasting your time today, as Professor Tilley will discuss her research in the records of the Senate Judiciary Committee's Special Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency. Her research supports her book project, Children, Comics, and Print Culture, A Cultural History of Comics Reading in the mid-20th century. Professor Tilley will speak for part of the hour and leave time for you to ask her questions. Please remember that this session is being recorded for the NARA YouTube channel, and to serve that audience, we will ask that you wait for the microphone before posing your questions at the end. Professor Tilley, thank you.
From May through October 1954, the letters arrived at a steady pace. Some came on colorful stationery. Sometimes that stationery seemed more befitting perhaps of a MASH note than a protest letter. Some letters bore multiple signatures. Others were signed anonymously, like this one from a comics fan. Some came on pre-posted cards. Others ran for pages. Some writers used business stationery and formal letter writing conventions, seemingly in an attempt to disguise their ages. Other writers' ages told their ages outright, although often their handwriting and spelling would have betrayed them anyway. In total, nearly 500 letters reached the offices of the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency during that 6-month period. The lion's share were written by young people between the ages of 10 and 20, almost all of them comics readers, almost all of them protesting the subcommittee's investigation of a purported link between comics reading and juvenile delinquency. The writers feared that the government would take away their beloved comics. My talk today will take a closer look at these letters and their writers, not so much for the purposes of a deep analysis, but to help you understand something about the scope of their contents and the role they play in helping us understand mid-century U.S. social and cultural history. Out of necessity, I want to provide some brief context for them. And finally, especially for those of you who work here at the archives, I want to help you understand a little more about the collection of which these letters are part. Now, in the years following the end of World War II, American youth's love of all things comics boomed. Comic books, originally conceived in the early 1930s as promotional pamphlets that repackaged newspaper comic strips, captured the imaginations of young readers, especially after the introduction of superheroes and other original adventure, humor, and science fiction content in the late 1930s. Surveys of comics readership by both marketers and reading researchers found nearly all children, boys and girls, read comic books regularly. New comic sales rose tenfold in little more than a decade, rocketing from 10 million copies monthly in 1940 to nearly 100 million copies monthly by 1954. Now, if you want to do the math, that's the equivalent of 8 comic books a year sold to every person then living in the United States, or more than 30 comics sold a year to every school-aged child in the United States. Now, this pervasive readership spurred some adults to action as they feared comics would seduce child readers to lives of illiteracy and violence. Literary critic and author Sterling North issued one of the first salvos in the campaign against comics in 1940, warning that comics, quote, hypodermic injection of sex and murder, end quote, would lead, quote, to a coming generation even more ferocious than the present one. Sort of strange to think about the greatest generation in those terms. Even the future U.S. poet laureate, Stanley Kunitz, got in on the comic shaming game, proposing that the comics could, quote, spawn only a generation of stormtroopers and coarse, audacious supermen, end quote. During the war years, adults were mostly too preoccupied with more pressing concerns to worry about comics. But that changed in part because comics changed. And in the immediate post-war years, comics publishers sought to hold onto more mature readers. So they expanded comics titles to include stories with criminal, romantic, and macabre themes in the late 1940s and into the 1950s. Now, North's earlier warning gained urgency, and teachers, librarians, and other adults renewed their fight against comics. Throughout the country, rallies, legislation, speeches, and bonfires accompanied adults' concerns. The apex came in the spring of 1954, first with the publication of psychiatrist Frederick Wertham's anti-comic study, Seduction of the Innocent, and second with 3 days of hearings by the United States Senate on the relationship between comics reading and juvenile delinquency. And this is from Binghamton, New York in the late 1940s. But first I want to mention a little bit about Wertham. Frederick Wertham was a German-born US psychiatrist who had studied under the eminent Adolf Meyer at Johns Hopkins University in the 1920s. He followed that with work at Bellevue, Queens General Hospital, and in private practice. He frequently consulted for New York courts. He had enjoyed popular success as the author of the forensic study Dark Legend, A Study in Murder, and again for A Show of Violence in the late 1940s. Beginning in 1946, he had also received favorable attention in the national press for helping found and operate the Lafargue Clinic, Harlem's first social welfare and psychiatric clinic. Yet in late 1947, when he testified for the defense in a hearing by the US Post Office about whether the nudist magazine Natural Herald was obscene, Wertham's attention shifted somewhat inexplicably from issues such as forensics, psychoses, and racial prejudice to comics. While Wertham had no problem with nudist magazines, those were relatively healthy, he felt, he believed comics were violent, sadistic, and dangerous to the welfare of young readers. Wertham spoke and wrote about comics frequently in both popular and scholarly settings. His ideas about the medium are neatly synthesized in his 1954 book Seduction of the Innocent, where he proposed that comic books are products of a deceitful industry, luring young readers with colorful pages, ubiquitous placement, and inexpensive cover prices. Crime comics in particular impaired young readers' moral, emotional, and social development. To Wertham's mind, the industry and its supporters, he would characterize them perhaps as sycophants, were duplicitous. They claimed that comics had educational value or promoted harmless fantasy, while those same comics peddled lurid and sadistic stories, which primed readers for lives of crime, illiteracy, neuroses, and more. The book contains numerous examples of the mischief and depravity of various young people he and his colleagues examined in psychiatric practice, or read about in news reports. Some, but not all of them, read comics. Wertham proposed restricting the sales of comic books, especially crime comic books, to readers aged 15 and over. Now that sounds superficially, maybe not so bad, But Wortham cast his net widely. A superhero fighting a villain, a cartoonish anthropomorphized animal smacking its pal, and visual depictions of true crimes were for Wortham all crime comics. In his estimation, 85 to 90% of comics that were published were crime comics. Now, the month following Seduction's release, Senators Robert Hendrickson, Estes Kefauver, and Thomas Hennings presided over televised comic book hearings that featured testimony from more than a dozen people, including Helen Meyer, who was vice president of Dell Comics, Walt Kelly, the creator of the Pogo comic strip, and who was then president of the National Cartoonist Society, and Bill Gaines, publisher of Entertaining Comics Groups, or EC. During the preceding year, the subcommittee, under the direction of Richard Clendenin, canvassed social workers, juvenile court judges, law enforcement officials, and comics industry professionals to assess the extent to which crime and other comic books encouraged juvenile delinquency. The subcommittee was tasked with investigating not only comic books, but also other forms of mass communication, such as television, and it held separate hearings for each medium. Now, for the comics portion of its charge, the subcommittee built on an earlier Senate investigation led by Estes Kefauver in 1950 into the publication and distribution of comic strips and comic books. That Senate committee had probed the impact of crime comics on juvenile delinquency as part of its broader investigation into organized crime. Senator Estes Kefauver commissioned Wortham to serve as a consultant for the 1950 investigation. And Wortham was eager to participate, at least at first. Ultimately, however, Wortham grew frustrated with Kefauver and the committee as the reports that came out concluded there was little evidence to connect comic book reading with criminal behavior. And despite his disapproval of the outcome of that 1950 investigation, Frederick Wortham did testify in the 1954 hearings. You can see him in front of the committee here. He represented what Clendenin's staff deemed, quote, the extreme or conservative position among psychiatrists. As such, his testimony balanced the more moderate position offered by Dr. Harris Peck, who directed the Bureau of Mental Health Services for the Children's Court of New York, and the liberal position held by Dr. Loretta Bender, who was senior psychiatrist at Bellevue and a consultant for DC Comics, the publishers of Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and other popular titles. Now, the testimony of these latter two psychiatrists is seldom cited in the scholarly or popular record. Instead, Wortham emerged as a star witness, holding forth in his imposing German accented English about his clinical evidence against comics. There was a second star witness, though, although he was not in the committee's good graces. Testifying immediately following Wortham in the afternoon of April 21st, 1954, Bill Gaines heard Wortham recapitulate the views on comics he had rehearsed in speeches and writing over the past 6 years. Gaines seemed eager to offer a retort to the psychiatrist's position, and the panel of senators and their counsel seemed eager to spar with Gaines. Now, in the 7 years since his father Max Gaines' unexpected death, Bill Gaines had transformed EC from a publisher of innocuous and sometimes educational children's comics, such as picture stories from the Bible, to one of the vanguard. EC's titles, including shock suspense stories, frontline combat, and weird fantasy, featured fresh artwork and riveting stories filled with black humor, surprise twists, and authentic details. Aimed at an audience of more mature readers, EC's lineup also featured plenty of gore, as well as challenges to prevailing social norms. All told, these comics found solid readership among teen and adult readers who were eager for something different, something other than maybe Bugs Bunny and Superman. Moreover, the company responded to readers' ideas by printing letters from fans and foes in the pages of its comics, sponsoring the EC Fan Addicts Club that facilitated the development of a visible network of readers, and inspiring some of the first comics-related fanzines. The subcommittee took issue with the contents and presentation of EC's stories, as well as its publisher's brashness. Bill Gaines had printed both a satirical take on the whole comics conflagration, Are You a Red Dupe?, which proposed that any restrictions on comics were a communist conspiracy, and an editorial urging EC's readers to share their views on comics with the subcommittee. I have to say that by the end of Bill Gaines' testimony, and he was hepped up on amphetamines from having not slept the night before, he had made both a forceful plea for the power of comics, and he had also made a panel of senators disgusted with his assertive flippancy. Probably not the best combination. Now, most young people living in the United States in 1954 had never known lives without the presence of comic books. Although comics had never been solely a child's medium, children consumed comics insatiably during the 1940s and 50s, with as many as 95% of elementary school-aged kids reading comics and 80% of secondary school-aged kids reading comics regularly. Comics were the defining cultural product of young people's lives during this time period. The phenomenal sales of new comic books and the equally pervasive trading and resale of those comics serve as partial testament to this truth. The variety of comics, related media, and tie-ins such as radio serials, along with the abundant consumer products from lunchboxes to bed sheets, decoder rings to ray guns that were also available in these decades, give further evidence to that popularity. And so it should come as no surprise that some youth were moved to defend comics in letters to the U.S. Senate subcommittee. The EC editorial, which was printed in its Fan Addict Bulletin as well as in its individual comics titles, provided readers with talking points. Among them, comics publishers will go out of business if the U.S. government intervenes. A small group of do-gooders are leading the charge against comics. That some people believe comics warp the minds of readers. That parenting, not comics, is at the heart of juvenile delinquency. That the Senate needs to hear from real comics readers. That freedom of the press is at stake. I think it's worth noting that none of these assertions was fundamentally untrue. Even more so, and I think admirably perhaps, Gaines and EC urged readers to write the Senate regardless of their views on this matter. Gaines believed that their voices mattered more than whether or not they supported EC's positions. Not surprisingly, many of the letters the subcommittee received borrowed heavily on the language of both EC's special editorial and the Red Dupe page. There are dozens of mentions of Robert Felix, Frida Kame, David Abrahamson, all of whom were experts quoted in EC's special editorial. Letter writers frequently refer to do-gooders who have probably never read comics, who are waging a war that threatens to turn the U.S. into a communist state like Russia, where a free press does not exist. Many writers urge the senators to pay attention to them because they, the readers, are the real experts on comics. Now, it's perhaps this rhetorical copying that led comics scholar Amy Nyberg, who is the only scholar I've identified other than me to discuss these letters, that led her to dismiss them with less than a page of discussion. Now, I should note that I'm a huge fan of Amy's work, but in this case, I'm thankful that she gave the letters a pass. Now, some letter writers put their own spin on the special editorial's talking points. For instance, this is Herman Burton, who was president of his Dallas, Texas area high school's Key Club, and he wrote the subcommittee a 2-page letter in which he informed them, quote, "I have read love, hate, crime, passion, war, science fiction, and horror books. Those people that want them thrown away or discontinued, well, they are either killjoys or party poopers or people with warped minds or communists." He signed it, "Yours for speeding this silly investigation along a little faster." Similarly, this trio of letter writers from right here in Washington, D.C. translated some of the editorial's talking points into slang, which they, helpfully not only for the senators but for me, translated. Quote, "We as Mad Comics fans wish to state our opinions on all comics. We think that comics are harmless entertainment and will not warp our minds. We also think that although some may be all frantic and far from the most, almost all of them come on real cool-like. And besides, those hubcaps who are complaining about the literature have never even penned one." That sense of humor and playfulness abounds in the letters. Peggy Elder from California wrote, quote, "Comic books have, for quite some time, provided a source of worry for those who must indulge in worrying about something." Mr. J&R of Beloit, Kansas told the subcommittee, "If you convince me that when most of the criminals are devoured by werewolves, that makes Junior wish to be a delinquent, then and only then will I believe in having horror comics banned." Don Robertson from South Carolina promised the subcommittee that, quote, "If you ban comic books, the FCBAOA stormtroopers," that would be the Future Comic Book Artists of America, "will storm the White House and steal every one of Ike's golf clubs." And a Minnesota high schooler got in a humorous jab on superhero comics. "I myself are against some comics trash like Captain Marvel, Superman, Plastic Man, Wonder Woman, and such heroes is positively revolting. Funny comic books are just moneymakers for big Hollywood-type artists." Now, one of my favorite lines came from a letter written by Dick Hewlin, who I'm happy to say is here in the audience today. He says, "I've read certain bestsellers which contained so much dirt that you could grow an oak tree between the pages." So thank you, Dick, for that line. Of course, there was plenty of sincerity in these letters too, often reflecting an awareness of greater realities. For instance, Leslie Hardy Jr. wrote, "The world is bad enough with H-bombs and McCarthy hearings that such bunk on comic books is crazy. I ought to be able to tell good from bad even if I am only 14. An anonymous writer acknowledged the specter of war more directly, writing, "In the near future, most of us shall be in the armed services. Some will be killed, maybe even me. So don't take away our fun and the freedom of the press. Just because you have no sense of humor doesn't mean nobody else has." And one of the adult writers, and there were some, this one was a young African-American man still in his 20s, demonstrated the value of comics during his time in the service. He wrote, "I served 3 years in the Air Force, 2 of them in Alaska. While overseas, these books seemed as food, medicines, morale builders to those at barren places." In some ways, though, sincerity wasn't enough. In late 1954, Time magazine carried a brief article highlighting psychoanalyst Robert Lindner's theories on teenagers. Now, Lindner is more popularly known as the author of Rebel Without a Cause, the hypnoanalysis of a criminal psychopath, and the same book on which the 1955 film starring James Dean is based. He shared with Wortham and other contemporaries, including perhaps a few members of the Senate subcommittee and their team, a fear that teenagers were unnaturally debauched, perverse, and sadistic. Lindner opined that, quote, "The youth of the world today is touched with madness, literally sick with an aberrant condition of mind, formerly confined to a few distressed souls, but now epidemic over the earth." Undoubtedly, the young people who wrote to the subcommittee were aware of this wider societal perception of their behaviors and lack of competence. As Thomas Hine proposed in his popular History of Teenagers in the United States, despite the growing middle class acculturation accompanying the rising percentage of young people attending high school, quote, "Adults looked at the children and saw not a blossoming bourgeoisie, but rather an alien culture in their midst." By necessity, many of the young writers, who would not be enfranchised to vote until age 21, had to situate themselves as competent, respectable teens who were above the influence of comics. Thus, we see many of the letter writers refer to their academic achievement and their moral uprightness, while also acknowledging that they were children, not adults. For example, Ron Baumgartner opened his correspondence to the subcommittee with his credentials. I ranked very close to the top of a class of 206. I am a member of the National Honor Society and have received a 4-year matriculation fee scholarship to Illinois State University. Another letter writer, Robert Brenninger, ended his letter this way. In closing, I wish to say that I attend church every Sunday and do not smoke, drink, or run around the street at all hours of the night, and yet read and now plead for continuance of crime and horror comic magazines, a fact which the various groups set on abolishing comic magazines seem to shun. Sometimes letter writers simply reminded the subcommittee that although they may be children, that didn't make them naive or incompetent. We saw a couple of slides ago when Leslie Hardy remarked that at age 14, he ought to be able to tell good from bad. Other writers commented that they were simply average, normal kids, careful to position themselves as neither rebels nor psychopaths. My favorite variation on this theme came from a teenager named Brian Mulholland. After outing himself as an avid EC reader, he wrote to the senators that he was, quote, as honest and clean as you would want your own son to be. When I spoke with Brian a couple of years ago, he had just retired as an attorney and told me that he couldn't have written a better letter today. Now, one of the aspects of studying these letters that I found most valuable is discovering how some of EC's most ardent fans, the fan addicts, supported the letter writing effort. It's possible to trace, for instance, some of the letter writers through appearances in letter columns and comics trading requests in the fan bulletins. For instance, this is a trio with Norm Benedict. He told me a couple of years ago that he sold almost all of his ECs to pay for grad school, but he wrote to the subcommittee. He also had at least one letter published in the EC letters columns, and you can see his name here as well in the trading post. But there were others. Roy Thomas, who many of you may recognize as a longtime writer and editor for Marvel Comics, was a high schooler, an EC fan addict number 19214, living in Missouri in 1954. He wrote the subcommittee giving them a lesson about the different categories of comics, delineating the differences among funny animal, superhero, and other comics genres. More important, he described his feared scenario should the Senate act to regulate comics. And this is a long quote. He says, somebody kills horror comics. Horror and crime are related somewhat, so crime dies next. With crime dies the hero comics. Next come the people and kill cowboys. By this time, science fiction is cut, and romance is next. Teenagers follow, then humor mags, if they didn't already go out with horror. Finally, little Lulu and her animal friends go. So please, don't start something that can end in even Kingaroo and Little Abner disappearing from the comics pages. Landon Chesney proudly told the subcommittee that he had read over 200 of the comics under review. Based on his reading history, he proposed that the Senate would better spend its time investigating the role that prostitution, bars, and substandard housing played in investigating juvenile delinquency. Chesney remained active in fandom throughout his life. He contributed original drawings and original comics to underground collections and fan publications, including this cover in full EC art style for Bill Spicer's 1964 fan magazine. Now, Bill Spicer is some convenient connective tissue here, and although there's no letter from him in the subcommittee's collection, he was a fan addict, contributing this cover art for an early 1950s fanzine published by fellow teenager Bob Stewart and distributed nationally to a few dozen teen subscribers. Stewart, who died 2 years ago, was as loquacious, witty, and thoughtful as a teenager as he was as an adult. He parlayed his fan interest into a career as a comics critic and reviewer, an editor, a licensing director, curator, and underground cartoonist. In 1954, though, Stewart simply wanted to help the subcommittee understand fandom and the role that EC played in the lives of teen readers. I would be remiss not to mention the letter from E. Nelson Bridwell. Although he was in his early 20s when he wrote to the subcommittee, Bridwell is important here because, like Bob Stewart, he was central to fandom and comics. A frequent contributor to EC's letter columns, Bridwell eventually wrote for the company's Mad magazine before going on to a lengthy career as a writer and editor for DC. His knowledge, which was legendary, is on display here. In this letter, among many other things, he ties the concerns about comics with historical concerns about dime novels and literary novels in previous centuries. The final big-name fan I want to mention is Phil Proctor. And those of you of a certain age may recognize Phil as a founding member of the surrealistic comedy troupe, the Firesign Theater. In 1954, though, Phil was 14, and he was fan addict number 544, which is an impressively low number. He told me that the comics hearings helped spur his interest in doing satire professionally. He said he wanted to spend his life ridiculing, quote, the blue-nosed, tight-assed censors who tried to take his comics away from him. His letter to the subcommittee shows his early promise, and let me quote, you can tell me if you think this wasn't a daring thing for a 14-year-old to say to the Senate. He wrote, "Read one, you asses, and don't look for blood and gore. Read the story." End quote. Nearly 500 different letters means that there are nearly 500 different stories to tell. Actually, more than that, since a number of letters have multiple signers. There are so many more I could share with you. Young married couples who wrote, mothers who shared their comics and some who didn't with their kids, some African American readers, other letter writers who learned something about racial tolerance from reading EC comics, and plenty of girls, including one who was an early race car driver in North Carolina. At the end of the day, it's these stories that motivate me. Although I came at comics history from a perspective of seeking to understand why and how librarians and teachers regulated young people's comics reading during the mid-20th century, my work in the Senate subcommittee materials, together with related work in the Wortham Papers at Library of Congress, opened my mind to more important possibilities. In 2010, when I first spent time in the Wortham Papers, which had been closed to the public for nearly 30 years, I realized relatively quickly that he had abused the trust of the young people he treated, the young people whose stories form the intellectual core of the supposedly scientific seduction of the innocent. As I read through his notes and case studies and other research materials, I realized that Wortham had fabricated, exaggerated, invented, misquoted, and generally failed to be upright in his treatment of young people's stories. I wrote about some of what I found, and it brought me some unexpected notoriety, which has been fun and rewarding, but even more important, it showed me the value of thinking about comics readers and their stories. So my work for the past few years has been focused on finding ways to save, find, and even tell comics readers' stories. Because even though comics were the defining cultural product, at least in terms of print, of the mid-20th century, almost no attention has been paid to what comics meant to readers, how they thought about comics, and what they did with comics. The letters here, which I have to tell you are an amazing treasure, as well as other sources like memoirs, newspaper articles, reader surveys, and fan letters to folks like Milton Caniff and Walt Kelly, and those are held at Ohio State University, are helping me tell those stories. When I can, I interview readers. And to date, I've conducted about 30 interviews with readers who wrote either to Wortham or to the Senate when they were young. So what about the rest of the Senate subcommittee materials? There are lots related to comics. There are missing pieces. For instance, only some of the questionnaires and witness preparatory materials are present. Likewise, correspondence between committee members and other entities is absent. I know this because I've seen it partially replicated in other collections, such as the Wortham Papers at Library of Congress and the National Cartoonist Society papers held at Ohio State University. I suspect some materials are held in the personal collections of Senators Kefauver and Hendrickson at University of Tennessee and Syracuse University, respectively. There are some random gems, though, in the subcommittee materials. For instance, the collection includes a small run of the comic magazine publishing reports, which gives useful information about on-sale dates and new titles. And I have to tell you, these are almost impossible to find outside of private collections. There are some lovely examples of letterhead from comics publishers, such as this one from Archie Comics. It also holds a couple of copies of the State of Louisiana's Revenue comic book, which was an interesting experiment in making state financial information more understandable. There were at least 2 issues published. The only other copies I'm aware of are in the State of Louisiana's archives. You can also find the reading notes that the subcommittee staffers compiled on various comics. And it's fun, as a comics reader, to see how they summarized and described the stories and counted up the violent deaths and killings and how people died. And there is correspondence between the subcommittee and the Comics Code Authority, which is valuable in part because the authority's own documents seem to have been tossed out in the past few years. Which brings me back to the letters from these young writers. In many ways, Donald Lowry, the man whose letter gave me the title of this talk, "Dear Sirs, I believe you're wasting your time," Donald Lowry was right. The Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency issued its report on comics in March 1955, concluding that there was no certain proof of the relationship between the reading of crime and horror comics and the incidence of juvenile delinquency. The report recommended that parents, social welfare professionals, educational and psychological researchers, comic book publishers, and others cooperate to investigate, quote, the exact kind and degree of influence exerted by comic books on children's behavior. In addition, the subcommittee urged as a national aim the elimination, quote, of all materials that potentially exert detrimental effects. That would be a lot. The subcommittee's proposals meant little, as comics publishers had already banded together to form the Comics Magazine Association of America, the CMAA, in September 1954. The CMAA created its own self-regulating editorial practice, the Comics Code Authority, initially headed by Judge Charles Murphy, thus successfully avoiding federal intervention. Like the Motion Picture Production Code, the CCA carried no legal authority, and publishers were not required to participate. Yet few publishers could get their comics onto newsstands without the CCA's seal of approval. Scores of comic book titles ceased publication, including the EC titles that resonated with so many young fans and letter writers. Many publishers simply found it untenable financially or creatively to meet the CCA's requirements. The Comics Code didn't tolerate lust or gore, unsavory illustrations, attacks on authority figures, stories featuring vampires, werewolves, or curvy women, or a myriad of other elements that had helped comics resonate with a generation of children and teenagers. Comics readership, especially among young people, began a decline that continued for decades. And by the time I was growing up in the 1970s, I was an exception among my friends for being a comics reader. Although kids reading comics today is less of an anomaly than it was 40 years ago, comics have competition from so many other forms of media and technologies. And I should note that the Comics Code was in effect with modification through February of 2011, so nearly 60 years. 2 final notes. That Don Lowry kid, I believe, sirs, you're wasting your time, he turned out okay. He served in the Air Force and eventually went on to become a noted tabletop game designer and publisher. A second little footnote. A couple of you have already heard this story, but yesterday I was sitting in the manuscripts reading room at the Library of Congress, and I just happened to stumble across Bob Stewart, the young man who was editor of the EC Fan Bulletin. I stumbled across his fanzine, Petrusby #1, which he sent to Wortham in 1954. Now, I got to know Bob by phone. We spent a lot of time speaking to one another in the year and a half or so before he died. And Bob told me multiple times that, you know, he had sent this copy to Wortham, and he had corresponded, and I have spent I don't know how much time looking through the Wortham materials, and it wasn't until this trip that I happened upon it. I can tell you that, like a lot of archival research, it was very serendipitous. I just happened to request a box that I hadn't requested before, that I didn't think I was going to find anything of value in. And there it was. The reason I bring this up is because in the closing pages of Petrusby, there was a note, probably from Bob, that mentioned that the Senate was having investigations of comics, and that there would be a further report in the next issue. And I really think that he probably couldn't imagine, nor could any of those readers imagine, that within just a few months, all of their EC comics would be gone off the newsstands. So with that, I will wrap up, and I'm happy to take questions.
Karl-Henrik Geschwind. A very fascinating story. I'm kind of curious, coming at this as an outsider, about the missing corporate influence. That is, where's Walt Disney, where's Warner Brothers? I mean, Wile E. Coyote is pretty violent too. Why isn't he being attacked? Or well, is he being attacked?
He was. So Wortham certainly felt that Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse and some of the Warner Brothers properties like Bugs Bunny would qualify as a crime comic. But those were licensed products that were published by Dell Comics. And Dell was an entity unto itself. It had such tremendous sales that it did not feel threatened by these attacks on comics, although it did amp up some of its internal PR to help protect itself. But Dell's vice president, testified as a favorable witness at the Senate hearings. So there was some immunity, in a sense, to concern with those properties.
Was there any response, either internally, people writing memos to each other within the Senate, or a response to the kids' letters? What did they think about the letters that were showing up?
That's a great question, Scott. There is some, duplicates of correspondence that the committee sent back. It's interesting, though, because almost all of the letter writers I've spoken to recall getting nothing from the Senate, not even a postcard of acknowledgement. Although apparently they did send at least letters to some writers. And usually it's fairly basic, thank you for your, thank you for your comments, or simply an update about the hearings. And outside of, let me go back to the beginning, near the beginning. Outside of the compilation of information about letter writers, where they, almost there. You can see they listed location and age if they knew, and pro or con, and maybe a note. And you can see that almost all of the correspondence they got was favorable. But at some point, they even quit compiling this list, because this list, I think, has fewer than 300 letters listed. And so there are several hundred that are unaccounted for. And so at some point, they just, I don't think, cared about the letters that they continue to receive.
So the name's Rod Ross. I retired from the Center for Legislative Archives on April Fool's Day. Your talk was wonderful.
Thank you.
Your Illinois connection an added bonus. I have a couple of questions that are really general questions about the collection. I don't remember any part of the collection dealing with what would consider causes of juvenile delinquency, like substandard housing. Were there that I missed? Second, could you describe the National Archives comic collection? I know there's a superb run of Bad Magazine. How would you rate the other kinds of things? And lastly, were there other nations in the world that had the same kind of interest in terms of prohibition on violent comics?
I'll work backwards. Thank you, Rod. I'll work backwards and say yes, that many other countries at different times, including from the 1940s on, did have social and cultural interest in violence in comics. So in the post-war years, for instance, in Germany, there were concerns that about the importation of American comics, that they were too totalitarian or fascist in some of their portrayals, especially the superhero comics. And throughout Europe, and including South America, Australia, even Japan, at different times, there have been concerns about comics and violence. So every country has handled it a little bit different. There are still bans, for instance, in England on horror comics, and there are still restrictions on certain types of literature in New Zealand, for instance. So there are still places where this is an issue. The second question about the Senate's comics collection, I would love to answer, except I've not ever been able to see the comics. So I've requested a couple of times, but I haven't been permitted to see them. The other thing I would say about and I've just spaced what your first question was.
The first question was whether there were what we would consider legitimate reasons.
Oh, yes, yes, thank you. Actually, yes. So there are questionnaires that were sent, questionnaires and interviews that were sent to folks like probation officers and juvenile court judges and social workers, and were solicited from communities nationally. What you find in that is that most of the responses that the Senate got say, you know, comics aren't an issue. And they list lots of other things. Sometimes it's the beginning of the drug culture, very minimally, usually marijuana. Sometimes it's petty crime and parental issues, but comics are seldom listed as a significant influence. And I didn't mean to, I would love to see the Senate comics someday.
I notice in your list there that all the letters on your list are from New York City. And I'm sure not all of them were from New York. Was there a noticeable regional pattern to the letters?
You know, they really came from everywhere. I haven't done the geographical demographics for the letters. What they did, why you're seeing all of the New York here, is that one of the staffers apparently grouped everything that they had at one particular time by state and region. So when they made the list, you know, you could go down and see all of the letters from Indiana, for instance, or New York. But I can't think, you know, there were letters from Hawaii, there were letters from Texas and Washington State and California, all over the Central Plains areas, so I really can't think of a region that wasn't represented. And there were even a couple of letters, I believe, that came from the Philippines. And I don't believe, you know, there may be a couple of other international letters.
Just to piggyback a little bit on
Yeah.
what you had talked about with the international answer, Rod's question. Part of the driven factor of a lot of these international nations like Canada, Great Britain, and Germany was not just about the stuff being horrible and terrible and or corrupt our youth, but also the fear of American dominance and their cultural stuff. So they didn't want their comic industry to be killed by the American comic industry, basically.
Yes.
So part of it's driven by that too. I almost forgot my question now. I'll have to come back to it.
Okay.
I'll ask you. I'll
All right.
remember between now
All
and
right.
then. But no, great talk, by the way.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
I'm wondering about Estes Cafaro. I seem to remember he got fame later on for going after the mob. Is he just in general a grandstanding guy? Was this really just an exercise in grandstanding?
Probably. So the mob bit was actually with the 1950 hearings. That was how he got into all of it, you know, but he had grand political ambitions and unfortunately died before he could have a chance perhaps to see those through. I don't have it in this talk, but I have an image, a really poor copy from a newspaper. I think it's from a 1956 newspaper, and it's Kefauver with his wife and their 3 daughters arrayed around them, and all the daughters are reading comics. And I love it. And it's interesting because you know, the photo is blurry, but good enough that you can make out the titles. And I checked, and they're all Dell and Fawcett comic books from the Senate hearings, I believe. He may have taken a few home.
Now I remember my question. Now, in this day and age, normally we would expect certain groups to come to the defense of the comic book publishers. And if I remember correctly from the hearings, people like Kniff and Kelly weren't particularly kind to the comic book industry. Part and parcel, it is believed, to protect themselves from anything in the comic strip world, to keep the senators away from them, basically. Yes. But where is, so, for example, the ACLU doing all this? Apparently nowhere to be found, I guess, right?
No, the ACLU was silent. The American Library Association, which today is a voice for intellectual freedom and you know, against censorship, was silent during this time period. And it's interesting, the National Cartoonist Society, you're absolutely right, that they were, they testified, Milton Caniff and Walt Kelly did. And they were very clear to delineate that there was something different about newspaper comic strips than there was about comic books. And they wanted to be sure that the Senate didn't come after comic strips. Now, they curried a lot of favor. And it's interesting because they actually agreed, and I'm still sort of sorting this out, but they agreed to cooperate with some of the Senate subcommittee on an investigation of some cartoonists, and I think it's mostly related to one single cartoonist. They also were very clever to invite some of the committee members and staff to the National Cartoonist Society dinners, and they attended. So they were, you know, they knew what was going on. And there were some other bits like that that showed that there was this strong preference politically for newspaper comic strips, that they had been able to organize and come forward. That was recognized.
Well, Carol, thank you so much.
Thank
It was
you.
a very enlightening talk, and you've
you.
demonstrated, as are other scholars, that there's surprising stories in those miles of boxes we have upstairs. So
Even more to find.
more to find. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming.